This is lecture week 2, the second part of the lecture where we discuss the history of social welfare policy. And to do so, we go all the way back to Europe in the 14th and 15th centuries. And back then, the preferred method of addressing poverty and of helping the poor was simply through mutual aid. So if your neighbor were poor, then it was up to the local churches. It was essentially up to the private sector to provide assistance to the poor. So local churches, wealthy landowners were responsible for taking care of the poor. But society becomes more complex, and so the social ills that accompany a more complex society also start to emerge. And so we have government intervention for the very first time in terms of addressing poverty. And that's the statute of laborers in the late 14th into the 15th centuries, one of the very first recorded measures or efforts to address poverty that emerges during this era. And so we're starting to see industrialization. In other words, we're seeing a shift from a farm-based economy in England during this time to one that's more industry-based, and specifically around the wool industry. And as I was suggesting, society becomes more complex. This marks the end of the feudal system, end of the farm-based system, into one that's more industry-based. And so we're moving from a system of mutual aid to one where government has to take a more centralized role in providing assistance to the poor. And so to that end, by 1601, we have a major piece of legislation designed to address poverty, and that's the British Poor Laws of 1601. So we have a confluence of different factors that led to the British Poor Laws. We have industrialization and all the different social ills that often accompany industrialization, unemployment, crowding in the cities. People are flocking to the cities for jobs. We have poverty, of course, and so the British government, they passed the British Poor Laws in 1601. And so, for taking a look at this legislation, there are some main characteristics that we look at here. This law distinguishes between the deserving and the undeserving poor. Many of us, even today, have notions of categories or persons who may be considered deserving versus undeserving. And so, if we're thinking about, as examples here, the aged, the blind, the disabled, the orphaned, and the widow, these are all, of course, categories that even today we consider to be deserving or worthy of assistance. And so the law back then, they made that distinction that some were deserving of assistance and others were undeserving. And if we're thinking about vagrants and drunkards, these are classes or categories of persons who might be considered undeserving under the British Poor Laws. And so for the different categories of poor, whether they were deserving or undeserving, we have different forms of relief. We had something called outdoor relief versus indoor relief. We don't really use these terms today, but historically, this is the terminology that we used. And so we have outdoor relief, which is synonymous with, let's say, community-based aid today. So assistance was provided in the communities, people inside their own homes during this time. And then we have indoor relief, or something that's synonymous to institutionalization. So things like workhouses, or almshouses or poorhouses, these are all different forms of institutionalization that we used. And so for the deserving poor, we have a different form of relief. For the undeserving poor, we have a different form of relief. For the deserving poor, we would send them to almshouses where we would provide our alms or givings. And then for the undeserving poor, we would send them to the workhouses or the poorhouses. This is sort of the precursor to our modern day prison system. And then finally, we have some other characteristics of the British Poor Laws here. We have strict residency requirements. You had to be a resident of a particular jurisdiction, a local jurisdiction, to receive assistance from your government. And then, of course, another important point here is that we have local administration of assistance. All right, so at this time, it wasn't that we had a federal government that provided welfare assistance. It was local government units in Britain called parishes that provided assistance to the poor. This is Benjamin Franklin speaking about the British Poor Laws of 1601. This is Ben Franklin in 1766, by the way, speaking about the British Poor Laws of 1601. He says, the day that you passed that act, you took away from the people's eyes the greatest of all inducements to industry, frugality, and sobriety. In other words, by passing the British Poor Laws, you took away the incentive for people to be industrious, to work hard, to be frugal, in other words, to save, and you took away the incentive to stay sober by passing the British Poor Laws. This is his view of the British Poor Laws. By giving them a dependence on someone else than a careful accumulation during youth and health for support in age and sickness. So essentially, he's saying that we're creating dependency we're creating dependency on the part of recipients, welfare recipients, and we're giving them an option besides careful accumulation. We're taking away the incentive for people to accumulate, right, to save for a rainy day, in other words. So the suggestion here is that people should be saving their money for when they get older, for when they get sick, in other words. And he says, I think the best way of doing good for the poor is not making it easy in poverty. Don't make it easy for the poor, he says. He says there's no country in the world, referring to Britain, where so many provisions are established for the poor, so many almshouses for the aged of both sexes. In short, he says you offer a premium for the encouragement of idleness. He says we're encouraging laziness, right? Encouraging idleness. And then he says you shouldn't now wonder that it has its effect in the increase in poverty. So that last section there, he's saying that by passing the British Poor Laws, you actually increase poverty. This was legislation that was designed to address poverty, but it's having the opposite effect. It's actually increasing poverty, is what Franklin believes. And so we move to the U.S. system. The early U.S. system, of course, is in the late 18th century. This is the very beginning of our formal history. And so recall that I had suggested the U.S. system is based largely on the British system. We carried over the British legal system, and with that we also carried over the poor laws. And so all the different characteristics we saw before in the way of establishing indoor versus outdoor relief, the strict residency requirements, all these things apply in the U.S. system as well. And then of course we also have a history of auctioning off the poor here in the U.S. And this is where we take just a slight detour, and not necessarily the history of social welfare policy per se, but the origins of the social work profession, the history of the profession as opposed to the policies. But one origin of social work is in the child saving movement. We're talking about, now we're sort of fast forwarding to late 19th century. And so the child saving movement, this is in response to poverty, to child poverty that is rising in New York City around this era. And so you have a man named Charles Loring Brace who has a specific view about how to best address child poverty. So he thinks the best way to address child poverty is by removing kids from the poor homes, sort of a different view from what we have today in terms of trying to keep families together in trying to promote family preservation. But he says take the kids out of the poor homes and put them on what are called orphan trains and send them out to the Midwest. Right? These are New York City kids. Put them on orphan trains and send them out to the Midwest and auction them off to wealthy families where they would presumably learn good morals and how to succeed in life. So that's Charles Loring Brace's approach to addressing child poverty. He establishes his own foundation, the Children's Aid Society in New York. And so this is the precursor to a modern child welfare system, right? So foster care, child protective services, this is where it all arose, in the child saving movement. And then we have another sort of root of social work or origin of social work, and we have the charity organization societies. And Mary Richmond is responsible, she's one of the leaders of the charity organization societies. And so she has a very specific view about poverty during that era and how to address poverty. She thinks poverty is rooted in individuals, in individual character. And so their preferred method of addressing poverty during that time is called scientific charity. They come up with this notion of scientific charity. And so what that entails essentially is using the scientific method to addressing poverty. And so if you think back to your elementary school science classes and what the scientific method entails, you have to think about what the research question is, what the issue is. You have to diagnose, you have to hypothesize, you have to come up with some solutions, and you test your theories and such. But you're applying the scientific method to the poor. The charity organization society workers would visit the poor and try to diagnose what's wrong with the poor, what was wrong with the poor, and then offer solutions. So typically in the way of changing people's character. And so this was the preferred method. Scientific charity was the preferred method of addressing poverty of the COS workers. And so if you're interested in a career in, let's say, counseling or casework and such, this is where all of that stuff comes from the charity organization society workers and their method of addressing poverty and of addressing individual reform. And then we have another origin of social work, and that's the settlement house workers. And they have a different view of poverty, not necessarily that poverty is rooted in individuals, but that poverty is rooted in structural, in societal structures, right, in institutions in our society. And so they established what are called these settlement houses. If you've heard of Hull House, that's one example of a settlement house, where they would establish these settlement houses in poor neighborhoods, and they were champions. They were instrumental in promoting advocacy efforts in changing our societal structures, and so they were instrumental, for example, in establishing our juvenile court system here in Chicago. So societal reform is their main purpose, as opposed to individual reform that characterized the charity organization society workers. So that was just very briefly our detour into the history of the social work profession, and now we get back on track in terms of the history of social welfare policy, and we move to the Great Depression era, and we're talking 1870 to 1920, and so some of the same sort of societal changes that we saw in Britain we're seeing in the US. So rapid industrialization, so society is becoming more complex, and of course the social ills that accompany industrialization occur here in the US as well. So poverty, unemployment, crowding, overcrowding in the cities, all these things are occurring here in the US. And so the government response to these societal ills also has to become more sophisticated. And so government has taken a more active approach, at least at the state level during this time, in terms of addressing these social ills. And so we look to the progressive era, the early 1900s, into the 1910s, that decade, and we have substantial reforms. With these social ills, we have our first state-level welfare legislation. So Mother's Aid, Mother's Pension laws, our very first welfare legislation at the state level has emerged during this time. And also, we have welfare assistance not only to poor families with kids, but also for seniors, persons with disabilities. All these state level laws are being established at this time. And then we have workers' compensation is also established. Lots of different measures to address the poor are established during the progressive era, including the women's right to vote. Women attained the right to vote in 1915, and also some labor reforms as well. And then we move to the modern, what we consider the more modern period. And this is in 1929. We're looking at the Great Depression of 1929. Presumably you've heard of the Great Recession. That's at the tail end of 2007 into 2009, where our economy, we faced an economic crisis. Well, think about the economic crisis that we went through, and unemployment rates upwards of 11% and such, and magnify that by at least twofold, and you have the Great Depression of 1929. So unemployment is close to 25% during this time. 1 in 6 individuals are living on state welfare. During this time, we have a severe economic crisis, and hence the term Great Depression. This is the Great Depression era. And so the government announces, the federal government that is, announces this new philosophy of addressing poverty, and that's the New Deal. That's this New Deal philosophy which replaces rugged individualism, or the idea of rugged individualism. That is, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president during this time, he comes into office and he says essentially that it's not just up to individuals and families to lift themselves up by the bootstraps, but the federal government will become much more involved in providing for its citizens. So this was a novel idea at the time. Up to this point, we never really had federal government involvement to this scale. It was usually at the state level. It was up to state governments to provide for the poor, but now we have massive federal government intervention during this era. And so during this New Deal era, we have lots of different federal laws that are passed, but most important for our purposes is the Social Security Act of 1935, which is basically the cornerstone, the framework of what we study in this class. If you take a look at the structure of the Social Security Act of 1935, Social Security, TANF, all of those different programs that we study today were established during this era. And so we have this structure that we'll look at in the next part of this lecture, all these social insurance programs, a plethora of public assistance programs that are passed as part of the Social Security Act of 1935 that establishes assistance in times of crisis. Right? And so we'll take a closer look at what this dichotomy entails, this distinction between social insurance programs and public assistance programs.